What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. Phantom Nightmare just recently came out, and there's lots of speculation about what the best decks are going to be, with the top 2 to top 3 best decks already pretty much set. Those positions even before the format has even begun, right? But we can pretty surely know what those decks are going to be. But we still have lots of variety in the format. We have lots of other decks we want to talk about, and today I'm going to bring you the top 10 decks that for me are going to be the best decks to compete in this format. Before we go into the top 10, I want to bring forth some honorable mentions that for me are 3 decks that can actually compete in this format just because of the nature of the decks, right? First deck for me is for Wonderies. It's a shifter deck. It can be pretty consistent with the new spell that was released, Swallow's Nest, I think it's called. It's something like that, which just acts like a secondary Advent Wind, right? It's a crazy deck that can help push through boards, and its first turn board is just kind of crazy against the best decks in the meta, right? Like Snake Eyes and Fire Kings. Shifter plus Empen is basically an FTK. Plus, with the help of the Heartpiece Feather Storm, we can basically turn skip an opponent in a deck that doesn't even special summon. So I think that's pretty relevant for the next format. It does tend to break, but Flu players already know that. Other deck I want to talk about is Centurion, right? It's a really consistent deck, really cookie butter. Always do what you want to do, locking out your opponent from playing with the Calamity. I don't think it has the power level to compete in this format, just because of how high above and beyond the other decks are. But locking your opponent from playing the game is actually a really strong win condition, right? And being that consistent at doing it, I think it can come a long way. The last deck I want to mention in honorable mentions is Salamangreat, right? So it's a fire deck. We got the new Princess. The new Princess adds so much more than people really realize, because we can get into the Raging Phoenix more consistently. We have some lines to play through Nib, and I think the first turn board plus the hand traps that we can add to the deck are going to be really difficult to play through, right? Like, I've seen boards where they finish with Baron, SP, the Salamangreat Roar, 3-4 cards in hand. So I think those kind of boards can be kind of oppressive. But yeah, that's all for the honorable mentions. Let's get into the top 10 best decks for this Phantom Nightmare meta. So coming in at number 10, I consider it to be the best fusion deck we have right now, and it's going to be Branded Desia, right? So Branded Desia has been for a while in the meta already. It has been going in and out from the best decks for a while now. We can actually consider it to be a contender just because of how powerful Mirror Jade is. We have the gimmick Puppet Luck to just lock out your opponent from special summoning. It can backfire against certain decks, but still, it's a really consistent option to just do your best to resolve Branded Fusion. And after Branded Fusion resolves, you can just go through a myriad of different plays, right? It just opens a different tree of plays. Mirror Jade is a really strong card. Just the banish without targeting, and then the end phase destruction effect is really strong. It can struggle due to hand traps like Ash being so prevalent in the meta and being so good against other decks, but that has always been the case for Branded Desia, right? And also, the deck can't really play that much hand traps itself. It relies more on playing the board breakers in order to break the opponent's board. It's still a great going second deck just because of the power of the board breakers it has in Super Poly, Triple Tactics, Thrust, and Triple Tactics talents too. We have Nadir Servant in some variants, so I do think that this deck can make a splash in this meta. The next deck I'm gonna be bringing is in the number 9 spot is Kashtira. So I know that with a Rysart band, many people really had their hopes down for this deck, but with Unicorn back at 3, the deck has really shown it's resilient, it's pretty powerful in what it does. It has a bunch of space for non-engine. It's a shifter deck. So at it being a shifter deck plus playing monsters that can just remove opponent's resources from the extra deck from the field face down, it can go second. It can play a bunch of non-engine cards like enemy controller, triple tactics, a bunch of hand traps. It just has it all, right? It does also have a great card in Kaeya Birth, which kind of counters card effects like Fire King Island from Fire King Island and the wanted spells also, because it's going to remove in the other chain, right, when all those spells resolve. So I do think it has the tools to compete in this upcoming meta. It's going to be a really high represented deck because the skill ceiling is low, the power level is pretty high. It can tend to brick, but the deck runs cards like Prosperity, Thrust, the field, terraforming, all that to just unbrick your hands and make it so that you can play, right? So next on the list is actually Treament. I do consider Treament to be an insanely powerful deck still, even after the ban list of the Chisus. It does have several pieces at 1. Almost all the pieces are at 1, right? But it still has a lot going for it since it can run the Horus engine. It does have the Treament's Kaeya for it to be milling cards. It plays Fenrir in order to search the Treament's Kaeya. It can play Toad, so it has different options. It's just a deck that when it pops off, there's just no stopping it, right? If the mills hit, you're probably going to lose. It does suffer against many of the hand traps that are going to be common in the format, like DD Crows, the Ghost Bells. Shifter is also played in different decks, but I don't count this deck out ever. Coming in at number 7, I do actually consider the Cats to be a real meta contender. I know they have been hit with the memories being the sleeping memory being put to 2 and Delicious was already at 1, so its consistency can be a bit lacking, but it's still really consistent. It can play through some disruptions. It can play a bunch of non-engine. Its Nor is still insane. Like, people are shifting away from cards that actually beat Nor because they're not good against anything else, right? Kurikara is going to be common just because it's searchable in the Fire King strategy and the Snake Eyes, but still purely has different ways to play around it. Going second, it's really good. You can just OTK or just wipe a board along with Happy and Delicious attach, stuff like that, and Pretty Memory attach. I'm sorry. It can brick just because of its consistency has been taking a hit. They only have 9 spells now out of the possible 12 quick play spells they should have in order to boost its consistency. So the purely white cat can whiff a lot more than it used to, right? But other fire decks are just going to be a bit much for this deck when going second, but I do think that Nor is a real menace, and even when going second, if you have the right tools, you can just break through any board, right? You can end in a 7, 8, 9 material Nor, which it's unaffected, and you can just spin cards from your opponent's field to make it so that they cannot do anything to you, correct? So coming in at number 6, it's a great big old combo deck in Adium. Adium is insane, right? It had been showing a lot of tops during the past few regionals during January before Phantom Nightmare came out, and even though I put it in number 6, I don't expect it to fall out of favor. It does lose to draw, which is going to be a big card on this format, but experienced and seasoned players can adjust to that and play through that, right? It's really consistent. It has lots of 1-card combos and 2-card combos, and I do think that the deck is in a position to be the combo deck of the format, right? Because Fire Kings are kind of a mid-range combo deck, but this deck, all it does is combo and put up an unbreakable board going first, which is possible after a few interruptions from hand traps. So one hand trap is not enough to stop this deck. You need multiple hand traps or big board breakers in order to play against this deck. One thing is Typhon really hurts this deck, right? So Typhon is a card that can just be slapped on going second on top of an effect failure or on top of any normal summon, and you can just smash the SP, bounce the Baron or the Dispatter. Now you leave them with no follow-up, and then just leave them with one monster on the field basically. I don't think Typhon is a big deal for players that want to just break combo players apart, and I don't think that Vanadium players need to be aware of this when they're doing their combo, so that they don't lose to these cards that are really powerful, right? So at number 5, I actually have a deck I love a lot from Phantom Nightmare. It's a new acquisition, and that's Voiceless Voice. Voiceless Voice is a ritual based deck which basically sets up a pseudo towers that's also an Omni Negate. And I say it's a pseudo towers just because while the continuous spell is up, you cannot actually target any of the light monsters for with effects, and you can only attack ritual monsters, right? And it's also an Omni Negate while low is on the field. So thinking about how the format is shaping up, that can be a bit too much to deal with for many of the decks. It can play a bunch of non-engine, it's really versatile, it has a bunch of extra deck space, so it can play Super Poly, but it's also really weak to Super Poly because they're all lights, and you can get just a Mud Dragon or a Garura done to you as easy as it is to blink, right? It's also too dependent on low of the Voiceless Voice, and I say this because low is a lot of times in the graveyard and you just revive her, right, because of her effect. But with cards like DD Crow, Ghost Spell, any Bestial Shifter, that can hinder the strategy and can only leave you with a 2050. You have the low on the graveyard, or with a 4200 beat stick on the field if low is actually on the graveyard. So I think you have to be aware of this when playing this deck. Many people are doing Dynamondo lines, going first just to end up with the trap and the spell and the Omni Negate, but that's just going to leave you really vulnerable to all of the cards I just mentioned. If you're playing this deck, be aware of that and adjust your strategy accordingly. At number 4, we have the best trap deck to ever have lived, right? And this is Labyrinth. Labyrinth is a trap deck that's not really a trap deck, and I say this because traps are usually they usually need to be set, and you have to wait a turn for them to be activated. But this deck just say no to that. You can set up trap activations as early as turn 1 thanks to the areas and thanks to the furniture cards. It has a great use of the transaction rollback in order to copy its trap effects in the graveyard and save the resources in the graveyard so that your grind game can get longer, right? It has access to a bunch of tools like the Ruma Cannon, Eradicator Barriers, Dimensional Barrier. All these cards can be set up really easily in this deck as early as turn 0, just because of how the deck functions, right? It has a problem for me, and it's that Ghost Spells in the format, also Super Poly, and the deck can be weak to both of these. Also, going first, the board it can set up, many of the new fire decks can actually play through the interruptions, right? Just because of how resilient they actually are. Like, people do not get how Fire Kings and how Snake Eyes, how resilient they really are against these different cards and against the different decks in the meta, right? So be aware of this. I know Labyrinth, good Labyrinth players will just adjust to this and will learn how to play against these new decks. But remember that if you're playing against the Fire Kings, they have a lot of gas. They have lots of gas. So you have to manage your interruptions really carefully. Now, the last 3 decks are all fire decks, and I put Rescue Ace at number 3 just because it got hit on the last ban list, so it's a bit lower on consistency. It does have great tools still, right? Like Turbulence is a +3, and the deck has lots of good extenders. Right now, resolving Turbulence is almost guaranteed thanks to the Princess, because even if I Veiler or Imperm your Turbulence on summon, right, and I have the SP, okay, because I can just make the Princess revive the Turbulence effect, set the cards, and just go into another Link 4 or another Link 2. It has to be a fire because of Princess, but you are still setting 4 cards to your field, which is kind of insane, right? The weaknesses of this deck has always been the same. This deck has too much engine card that do nothing in its core, right? Because it feels really bad to draw any of the traps, especially multiples when going first or when going second, just because you cannot actually do anything with them unless you have the engine requirements already on the field. It's not enough to break this deck Spirit, and the deck is actually going to be still one of the best decks on the format. It's going to be up there for me in the top 5 best decks in this whole format until it get hits again. It's get hits again. And if other decks get hit, this deck will just go to the top, right? Just because of the nature of the deck and how good it can be. So for the last 2 spots, these 2 decks are interchangeable. They're going to be the number 1 and number 2 best decks during this whole format, unless some miracle happens and people figure out something. But on the number 2 spot, I have Snake Eyes, just pure Snake Eyes, right? It's real consistent, really consistent. It has a bunch of space for non-engine. It can run it. I've seen it being run with even the Sky Striker engine. It has room for hand traps. It has room for board breakers. It can play thrust. It can play tactics. It's just really versatile into what it can do, and the boards it can make are really strong. Also Flamberge plus the field spell plus Poplar, which is the new name for Populous here in the TCG, are actually insane. Like Flamberge is quite a good card, right? It's an extender for 2 monsters. It's a piece of interaction with your opponent. It can also special summon from the spell and trap zone, which is pretty insane. This is the deck, the fire deck, that loses harder to draw, although. So I do think that is what's gonna make it go between the first and second place with Fire Kings. It also can't depend too much on non-engines in order to break the boards. And since it's a Snake Eyes deck, people are going to be prepared for it, right, with their side decks and their non-engine. And lastly, for the number 1 deck, you guys know which deck it is. It's Fire King Snake Eyes. Fire Kings are just insane. They are really explosive. They are really resilient. They can play through a bunch of hand traps thanks to the nature of the deck. Plus, carrying just quick effect, main phase, just target pop in order to dodge stuff like Rescue Ace traps, Veiler, Imperms, anything that targets, right? It's just fodder for Kirin to dodge and summon itself. And it also, its graveyard effect is really strong. It has later interruptions, like its end board. It's really hard to interact with just because they choose when they want to do their stuff. So you can see their board is kind of mediocre, right? It can end up like tuning gates and some stuff in the graveyard, but it can really quickly turn into 6, 7, 8 interruptions with just an activation of card in the hand, right? That's because they have the Kirin in hand, they have the Flamberge in graveyard, they have the IP Masquerena in the spell and trap zone, they have the Princess in the graveyard, they have Appaloosa, they can make SP. It's a bunch of different stuff. It is a bit more prone to breaking than Snake Eyes version just because of the Fire Kings. So they just put in a small Fire Kings engine inside the Snake Eyes, so it's more like Snake Eyes Fire Kings. But those cards can be bricks, right? Like the Runix can be a brick, Kirin can be a brick, like the Sanctuary along with Fire King Island can be a brick. It really depends on the version you're playing and how much of that engine you're gonna use. But I think these decks are going to be the best. They're not easy to play. They are actually really rewarding to learn. They have lots of lines and they can play through a bunch of interruptions. So I do expect these 2 decks to be the best decks for the upcoming format. And until they receive some hits, it's gonna take a lot to take them out from the best decks. If you're not playing any of these decks I mentioned, don't get discouraged. I do think that there are a lot of resources for people that are playing the decks they like, right? Which is for me the most important part of Yu-Gi-Oh, just playing what you like. And even though these decks are really powerful, there are a lot of non-engine and just side deck options that you can just play to counter the meta. Stuff like the Diddy Crows, Ghost Spells, Soul Release, Gravekeepers, Inscription, Super Polys. You can get your hand on any of these cards. You can actually do pretty decent against these decks. Just don't bring like a table 500 deck and expect to do well. You know, just if your deck is, your deck is decent and you like your deck and you know your deck, Just learn the interactions of your deck against the meta, get the cards you need to counteract that meta, and I'm sure you'll do fine. So yeah, these were what I consider the best decks in the format, but that's gonna be my opinion, right? If you have different opinion, you can just comment down below what you think the best decks are gonna be. If I miss your deck, just tell me, we can discuss about it. Don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, share if you want. I'm gonna be uploading more videos in this upcoming week. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. I really hope you like this video, and be on the lookout for more. Peace.